The world is talking. World Talk Radio, Studio A.
The Andrews Raiders of 1862 failed in their mission. Some met death. Some got the Medal of Honor. We'll find out what happened to who when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
When I was 12, my father was killed in an industrial accident at the
vacant lot
where he worked. My mother insisted I stay in
the highway on-ramp
to get an education. So she took a job waiting tables at a
parking garage
to support us. She worked double shifts, and on her break, she would pick me up from
the highway on-ramp
and drop me off at the big
office building.
And I'd spend hours and hours just reading books. I remember every Saturday we'd have breakfast at the
parking garage,
and I'd tell her what I had read, and her eyes would just light up because she knew I'd end up in college, not working at the
vacant lot
like my dad.
When we lose a historic place, we lose a part of who we are. To learn how you can help protect places in your community, visit nationaltrust.org. History is in our hands. A message brought to you by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Ad Council.
Hey y'all, this is Stephen Cochran. As a country artist, I have traveled around this great country of ours, often meeting our brave men and women in uniform. And as a Marine and veteran of both the Iraq and Afghan conflict, I know how important it is to thank our troops who defend our freedom each and every day. One of the best ways to thank them is to give their children and spouses the gift of education. Scholarships for 2 years, 4 years, and vocational school. This is exactly what a national charity, Thanks USA, does. Please go to their website, www.thanksusa.org, to make a generous donation to the Thanks USA Scholarship Fund for the families of the troops, and I thank you.
Listen. The world is talking. World Talk Radio, Studio A.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. Today, talking with Russell S. Bonds, author of Stealing the General, The Great Locomotive Chase, and the First Medal of Honor. Very interesting book. It's published by Westholme, and the paperback edition is due out in September 2008. By the time you're hearing this, it ought to be out there, and very well worth picking up. An interesting account of a very dramatic sidelight of the war, the Andrews Raid. In our first two segments, we talked about the origins of the raid and the raiding party and their successful attempt to steal a locomotive, but then the pursuit and capture of the raiders before they could get the locomotive back to Union lines. We ended our last segment with the raiders in captivity, their leader Andrews sentenced to death, others about to be put on trial. Russ Andrews and the first 7 others who were tried were all found guilty, and that meant a death sentence, which, as you and I talked about a minute ago, is of questionable legality. There's certainly an argument to be made that these were legitimate soldiers simply engaged in commando operations. The counter-argument is they were in civilian clothes and not playing by the rules, but regardless, they're found guilty. Tell us about the executions.
Well, Andrews and the Unlucky Seven, as I refer to them, are brought down to Atlanta for their sentences to be carried out. Andrews is first on June 7th, 1862, is taken to the outskirts of Atlanta. And hanged. The hanging does not go well. He's a very tall man, and the rope they use is a little bit too long. So he actually is sort of kicking in the dust while they try to dig out enough dirt under him to do the job. More of a strangling than a hanging, really. And then 10 days later, the other 7 are taken out to another site in Atlanta, across from our Oakland Cemetery, if you've been here to visit us, and those 7 are then hanged as well. Again, somewhat botched. Two of them, the two largest and heaviest members, have their ropes break and have to be hanged a second time. So really grisly picture in both instances.
That's, as you point out, when a rope breaks during a hanging, some people take that as an omen of divine signal that this person is innocent. But it didn't work that way, or at least nobody let these two guys go.
No, the provost marshal didn't seem convinced by that argument. Now,
the remaining raiders must realize they're in prison, that their life expectancies are not very good at this point. They wrote to the Confederate president seeking clemency. What about that note? You don't seem to have a high opinion of that in your book.
Well, it's a very fascinating note for a number of reasons. First of all, just to have soldiers, the content of the note itself. Not only do they plead for mercy from Jefferson Davis, but they also say in the note that if he will spare their lives, then they will lay down their arms and sort of not resume their service as Union soldiers, which is, which somewhat remarkable, and of course easy, for us to criticize, perhaps looking back, but from their desperate situation in their prison cell, you can certainly see why they would make that appeal. It went up through the chain of command, and actually seemed to be fairly favorably received by some who handled it. But when it got to Jefferson Davis, he simply scrawled a note on it that said, please advise why we should make any distinction between these men and the ones who were previously executed. To me, sort of the cold response that you would expect, perhaps from the view that many folks have of President Davis. So at that point, they sort of get word that their appeals have gone unheard, and they resolve to stage an escape from the jail here in Atlanta.
Now, they're no longer being kept in the hole in the ground. That was in Chattanooga.
That's right. They're in a cell in the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. There's 14 left here in Atlanta, held in various cells, and they, come up with this plan to escape. Their cell doors are opened for their meals to be brought in, and one day they stage a effort to overpower first the jailer who feeds them, and then to run downstairs into the courtyard, and then attempt to overpower the guards and make it over the wall.
It sounds kind of far-fetched, but some of them actually make it.
Yeah, actually, 8 of the 14 in the ensuing chaos not only make it over the wall, but all 8 of them make it safely back to Union lines, which may be the most remarkable part of this entire story, because you have these men who had already been in prison for some months that go on foot with no food or provisions or really anything but the clothes on their backs, and make it several hundred miles back to Union lines, 4 of them up to Kentucky, 2 out to Union lines near Corinth, and then 2 of them actually went south and made it all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, where they were picked up by a ship in the blockading squadron.
That was really a remarkable piece of the story there, I thought, for those pairs who each made their getaway. The ones who went north, the ones who went west, that was clever enough to go to Corinth. Then 4 of them, as you'd expect, would go north. But the idea of heading due south, just what a clever idea.
Yeah, brilliant because it's so unexpected that they got a canoe and went down the Chattahoochee River to the Apalachicola River and then on to Apalachicola Bay, where, again, they were saved by a U.S. Navy captain who saw them paddling along in the bay. And just really a remarkable escape.
Now, those who didn't escape were eventually exchanged, which, in the context of the note they wrote asking for clemency, it's worth recalling that in the Civil War, it was common to exchange prisoners up to a certain point, and it was also common to parole prisoners, that they would sign their paroles and then be allowed to go back to their own lines, but just not fight. And you were expected to honor your parole if you gave it. So when those prisoners offer not to fight again, it's not all that. It's different only in the sense of time. To give your parole, say I won't fight till exchange, is perfectly acceptable.
Right.
I guess, so it's not that drastic. But those who stay behind do eventually get exchanged and get to go back to Union lines. Is that right?
They do, in this early spring of 1863, and actually, they have sort of the perfect window there where exchanges are going on. The exchange system later sort of breaks down, as you know, and also I think by that time the raid was far enough in the past where it had somewhat receded as an event. At first, it seemed so shocking and threatening to the South when the raid occurred, but obviously by early 1863, so much blood had been shed, so many major battles fought, that I think this seemed like a fairly minor event by that point, and the raiders were almost forgotten. And then were swept up in a number of exchanges that took place in the spring of 1863. So 6 of them exchanged and then sent on to Washington, D.C., where they get an audience with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had heard of their exploits and wanted to meet them.
And that brings us to the subtitle of the book, The Great Locomotive Chase and the First Medal of Honor. How did the Medal of Honor get started?
Well, it started early in the war, again, sort of dark days when the Union was having a difficult time, and every War Department clerk in Washington was trying to come up with ideas of ways to get things back on track. A lieutenant colonel by the name of E.D. Townsend came up with the idea of creating a medal to honor valor and gallantry in the ranks, and therefore hopefully inspire some boldness. And General-in-Chief Winfield Scott early on is very sour on the idea. He thinks it sort of smacks of European snobbery. It actually struck me as very ironic given old Fuss and Feathers' own fondness for epaulets and uniforms and medals. But in any event, once Scott is relieved and out of the way, the idea comes back around, is first adopted by the Navy. Gideon Wells jumps on it, and so the Navy medal comes first and is created first, but soon followed by the Army medal, and then the Army medal becomes the first one to be awarded there in the spring of 1863.
The Purple Heart was already in place, was it not?
Right. The Purple Heart had been created by George Washington in 1792, awarded only a couple times, and then sort of fell into disuse. At that time was not a decoration recognizing a wound, but rather, again, a medal for valor or meritorious service. Purple Heart would come back in the 1930s in the way that we know it today. So there, other than brevet promotions, and briefly, I think there was a certificate of merit in the Mexican War. But apart from that, there was no. The U.S. just had no military medals until the Medal of Honor was created. And
so the medal was not expressly created for the Andrews Raiders.
No, in fact, there's some suggestion, if you read the accounts of how this went down, that Stanton was meeting with these fellows, and it's almost as if sort of a light bulb went off over his head, and he stepped out of the room and went back and remembered that he had these medals that had just arrived that were sitting back in a closet somewhere, and he seems to have decided almost on the spot that these were just the perfect people to give the first medals to. So he awards each of the 6 Raiders the Medal of Honor, the first one going to 18-year-old Private Jacob Parrott from Kenton, Ohio. And then they're taken next door to meet with Abraham Lincoln. And in a great stroke of luck for me, writing about this and for all students of the Andrews Raid, not only did one of the raiders write about that meeting with Lincoln, but also there was a reporter, Noah Brooks, who was present. So there were a couple of different accounts of these meetings with Stanton and Lincoln, and it's just very enjoyable to research and write about.
So let me ask about the research and writing process. We just have a few minutes left, but where did you find your material?
Most of it was here locally in Atlanta. There's a very large repository of material related to the Andrews Raid at the Atlanta History Center archives, much of it built and maintained by historian Wilbur Kurtz, whose name may ring a bell for some people as the historical consultant on Gone with the Wind. Kurtz was fascinated with the Andrews Raid and did a lot of research, and including most notably a number of in-person interviews with the surviving raiders around the turn of the century, when those that were still alive. So that's a great repository of material. A lot of stuff as well at Emory University, and then at various repositories in Ohio. Some of it internet research, some of it research by mail with various librarians and repositories. But for me, especially having a day job and a family here, having a lot of resources locally really helped me to research and get the book done.
How long did it take to do this project?
It was about 4 years, start to finish. A lot of that research, and then maybe a year and a half of actual writing, with research continuing. The research never really stops, as you know. So that was it was about a 4-year process end to end.
And do you see another Civil War book in your future?
I do. I'm working on a project now on the Battle and the Burning of Atlanta. The working title is War Like the Thunderbolt, subtitle The Battle and the Burning of Atlanta, and we'll focus on the action here at the gates of the city in the summer and early fall of 1864, and then take on also the civilian perspective with the bombardment, surrender, occupation, and burning of the city as well.
Well, I think, as with this topic, again, there were a lot of interesting issues of ethics and legality in war when you have that intersection of civilians and military there.
It's been very enjoyable to research and get into it. I'm really looking forward to continuing.
Well, this book is certainly very enjoyable to read. I think listeners to Civil War Talk Radio will want to get hold of a copy. Westholme Publishing is the publisher. The title of the book is Stealing the General, subtitle The Great Locomotive Chase and the First Medal of Honor. And the author is Russell S. Bonds. Russ, it has been a pleasure having you on the show today.
It's been a lot of fun, Jerry. It's been like talking to an old friend. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to Civil War Talk Radio.
Listen. The world is talking. World Talk Radio. Studio A.